We should have a clip here, I hope. I just wanted to comment.
My church is open and inviting.
My church is a place where there's always going to be a merciful response to what I'm going through.
They accept me for who I am.
I can come regardless of what's going on in my life.
It's a place where I feel safe.
My church is a place of forgiveness.
It's grace-filled.
It's a place where there's mercy for me.
My church is a great place to learn about God.
There's always something new, and I always seem to relate to what is going on.
My church is one of the most creative and inspiring places that I go every week, sometimes twice.
It's a place where my kids have a great time and they're learning, and I know that they are safe.
My church is a place where I can come and use my talents and can help other people.
My church is a place of healing.
Just gives us that extra support that sometimes is hard to ask for.
Anything I go through, there's other people and probably a group that are going through it too, and I can join with them.
My church is open and inviting.
It's grace-filled.
Fun,
Loving,
Creative,
Peaceful,
Healing.
Accepting,
Real.
full of God.
invigorating.
welcoming.
freeing.
Honest.
It's a place where God is alive.
It's my soft place to fall.
My church is where my family has started a story.
It's a place of hope, healing, forgiveness, and grace.
My church brought me back to life.
It's a place that I will always call home.
Please pray with me. God of all, open our hearts and minds to hear your word and to live in your love. Amen. I just wanted to comment on that second scripture that starts with Paul saying, "Oh, I didn't preach as eloquently as I had, and I stand before you in fear and trembling," because I sort of feel like that today. So I thought I would leave that part in so you know that even the great ones have moments where they wonder if they're getting through. I really like that clip that we just had because it describes, at least for me, the kind of church that I want to be a part of, perhaps the kind of church that I want to lead. It seems all friendly and kind of rosy, where everything is sweetness and light. I mean, who wouldn't want to go to a church like that? In a church like that, there's never an argument at the worship committee over what kind of music is going to be used in the services. The board never has to agonize over how they're going to pay the minister's salary. Everybody is welcome in the kitchen all the time, even if they're messy, and nobody's nose gets out of joint when someone sits in their chair. And I can tell you, as a member of the clergy who recently finished my MDiv, we are all looking for a church like the one in that clip. I imagine there would be a lot less clergy burnout if more churches were like that. But the reality is that churches are filled with real people, with real problems and real irritations. And we don't all agree on theology or politics or music tastes or even liturgies. A church congregation, just like any other institution, plays in an emotional field where people react to each other, sometimes in unhealthy and inappropriate ways. So if we are really being honest with the My Church video, it might include some instances like these. And I've taken these from real case studies of classmates of mine or that I have read. And I begin with this little disclaimer because I know very little about this congregation. From what I see, it's a warm and welcoming place. And if you hear something that I say that kind of touches a nerve, please engage it with grace and a kind heart, because I am not ready for nasty emails in my first week of work. So in one church, there was a cabinet where the UCW stored some important items, and they believed this cabinet was beautiful, but it was kind of big. Because they wanted to keep it safe at all times, they placed it in the minister's office, which was fine with one of the ministers, but then a new minister came and decided she did not want that cabinet in her space and had it moved out into the hallway. Well, you can imagine the kerfuffle that ensued when that happened. If I remember correctly, the UCW then had it moved back into the office. And believe it or not, this argument escalated to presbytery when the minister made an official complaint and they had to have mediation. Needless to say, the relationship was poisoned from the very beginning, because in the real world, my church is a place where people are territorial and argue over things like chairs and pews and carpets. At another church, this one was an Anglican one, a priest wanted to experiment with more contemporary services from the alternative Book of Services and the Common Worship supplements, rather than the Book of Common Prayer, which, by the way, was last revised in 1662 and is still, I love my Anglican brothers and sisters, don't get me wrong, but it's still the official worship book of the Anglican Church. Many of the new people in the congregation loved these new formats, but some of the longtime members resisted this change. They liked things the way they were. And one of them, who was a primary donor, threatened to withdraw givings if the new services continued. Many of us in the course said we had encountered the same kind of thing in our churches, because in the real world, my church is a place where people who give the most believe they have a veto on all that happens. Did I hit a nerve there? I don't know. I'm new. Another instance, this one was more personal, happened when I was working at a previous congregation. My M&P rep wanted to take me for lunch to get to know what I was doing, so we could get to know each other and find out, what was going on. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ministry and Personnel Committee, the M&P rep, your M&P rep, is supposed to be your support for your ministry, a buffer in the stressful times, and an ear when you're confused or stressed, that go-between between congregants who might not like what you're doing. They're just generally there to support you, hopefully. So I was explaining to him what I did as the worship animator, and he was explaining to me how he had come to be in the church. And then he told me that he loved the sermons, but the rest of the stuff that happened Sunday morning was irrelevant to him. And so now my job was the rest of the stuff. The music, the images, the drama, everything but the sermon. So needless to say, I did not feel supported. Because in the real world, my church revolves around a strong minister who preaches compelling sermons and is attentive to my needs. And the rest of the staff and the rest of the service really doesn't matter. And finally, a story from Tom Bandy, who is a consultant for church revitalization. He actually used to work for the United Church. He tells the story of a church that wanted to welcome families, who said they really valued children, but they wanted also to use the nursery room as kind of a multi-purpose room, and they wanted to make it beautiful to impress all the people who came in, and they put in a lovely white carpet into the children's room. Now, of course, the people who had chosen the carpet wanted to keep it clean, so they made rules for the room, which included no food or drink and no messy sand tables or paint. So in the real world, my church is a place that says they value children, but in their restrictions on average children's activity, it's obvious they really value carpets. So the reality is there will never be a church that is perfect, because there are no perfect people. But churches that lose themselves in trivial things or focus their energy on things that to many seem inconsequential have lost their sense of mission. Because if the church is going to be effective, if the church has a hope of being that place of grace and love that we saw in that video clip, it's got to hold on to the truths that we find in our scripture today. In the first reading, Jesus is asking his disciples who the people say he is. Obviously, by this time in his ministry, people are beginning to wonder what was up with this Galilean who speaks the words of God. To the authorities, Jesus was an iconoclast, a rebel who spoke words which could only be considered to them demonic. He couldn't possibly be from God. He didn't follow the rules. But others who had seen the miracles and heard his words speculated that he was John the Baptist, who you remember had been executed. And others were saying he was Elijah returned, or one of the other prophets. But Jesus is not interested in the speculation of the people at large. He zeroes in on Peter and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, who has seen this man at work, knows he speaks words of wisdom and that he brings a message of a transformed world where all live together under God's care. And Peter realizes for the first time in Mark's gospel, you are the Messiah, God's anointed, the liberating King. And there in that one sentence is the core of their ministry, and I dare say the core of ours, because to him, Jesus is the messenger of God. He is chosen of God. He has come to bring liberation to a people who are occupied both physically and spiritually. But as the story continues and Jesus begins to tell the disciples of the coming trials, Peter pulls Jesus aside and rebukes him. That's a strong word, rebukes him. The same word that is used when Jesus rebukes the demons who are possessing a man. Very strong word. And Peter's understanding, this comes from his understanding, from his history, that the Messiah, the anointed one, is supposed to be a royal king like David. Messiahs do not suffer and die on a cross. He wants this revolution to be without bloodshed, to happen without too much displacement, to be safe and secure. And as the disciples approach, because they want to hear what Jesus has to say to Peter's rebuke, Jesus says, "Get behind me, you tempter." Because even though it would be a lovely story if he was a royal king, Jesus knows that the journey is not one free of obstacles. That even though we are all called children of God, we still must take up our cross and follow. He says, if you hang on too tightly to things, to who you think you want to be, to that image of the perfect you, you end up losing yourself. And if you hang on too tightly to the image of the perfect building with your kind of people, you end up with a church without a center, a social club instead of an agent of transformation for a broken world. And if you lose Jesus, if you forget the way of the cross, if you're not prepared for sacrifice, then your church really doesn't matter in the grand scheme. And so arguments over pews and carpets and cabinets and music are just fine because it's an inside game. And of course, you're entitled to set up your club any way you like. But if you are truly called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus crucified and risen, then there is much more at stake than a nice place to spend a Sunday with people you call friends. That kind of church is ready to make hard choices, to suffer with a broken world, to sacrifice for justice, to be misunderstood and ridiculed. That church works hard to create a community of faith where love and grace are lived, and as U2 says, we get to carry each other. That is the understanding of his mission that Jesus is giving the disciples. God's way can be tough, demands hard choices and personal sacrifices, but we don't travel the road alone. And Paul makes this clear in our second reading. He starts out with this kind of false humility because, after all, he's been a missionary throughout the entire Mediterranean region, and he started churches that have thrived and continued, and he has written letters that even in his time are considered classics. I'm told he even published his own letters into a book. But he begins this reading by saying that he's not the expert. He doesn't preach as eloquently as he'd like. He isn't as wise as people think. Though he's been placed on a pedestal, He wants to disabuse his readers that it is his talent that has made the difference. Paul knows it is not he, the minister, that makes the difference. He says, I know nothing with certainty, but that Jesus is the anointed one, the Messiah, the liberating King. The words he preached did not persuade. Rather, he relied on God's Spirit to demonstrate God's power. For Paul, God's Spirit is the breath in the community. God's Spirit informs and transforms all that they do. He says, we have not received the spirit of this world that's rebellious and broken. We have received the Spirit that comes from God, so that we can truly understand the mysteries of God, so that we can truly accept the gifts of God. The love and grace that we saw in Jesus dwells in us by the Spirit. So I wonder to myself how a church would be if they really believed this, that Jesus was the anointed one and that the Spirit of God is in and among us. What would they say about my church? So first of all, for me, my church welcomes in everyone regardless of who they are or where they're at or the struggles in their life. There aren't conditions on entrance. You belong right from the start. And this is crucial in our day and age because people who are seeking a spiritual family come to the church in a different way than they used to. Diana Butler Bass is a scholar who looks at churches who are thriving in the mainline tradition. And she says that in the past, people were initiated into the church first by believing the right things, and then by behaving the right way, and only then, when they thought the right way and they acted appropriately, would they belong in the church. But now, in the churches that are thriving, that process has been completely reversed. The first step to entrance into a new community is that you belong. This is your place. We are your people. And after you've spent some time with the people who welcomed you with these open arms, you begin to understand how your life can be and has been transformed by the Spirit which is among them. And you behave differently because you've been loved and accepted. And finally, as the community enfolds you and your life has changed, then you believe. Or a better way to say this, you trust that Jesus is the anointed one and the Spirit of God upholds with love and grace and invites you in. So secondly, my church is a sacred home, a safe space where you can truly be who you are. It's a place that welcomes diversity and understands that life is hard and we need each other to make it through. We're brothers and sisters and grandmas and grandpas and children and youth, and we are interconnected by the Spirit, and our deepest longing is for the flourishing of all who come. It's a place of rest and peace and an opportunity to just be a community where grace is abundantly given and love is abundantly shared. But most importantly, at least for me, my church is out to change the world. We are not content to stand at our doors and welcome people in. Our job is not merely to create a safe place for our brothers and sisters to flourish, because ultimately, it's not about us or only about us sitting here in the pews. It's about the people in our community, our city, our world that are broken and alone, without hope, and longing for justice. It's about those who've been displaced by the downturn in the economy and need support to get on their feet. It's about kids who are hungry and need a nutritious meal to make it through the day. It's about those who have broken hearts and need a place to heal. It's about addicts who need somewhere to come clean. It's about LGBTQ people who are trying to find a church that accepts them for who they are. It's about those caught in the war zones and those refugees who are struggling to make it to safety. It's about our planet that is gasping for air. And I could go on and on, because we know that we live in strange times and that there are so many who seem lost or abandoned. So my church gets off of the pews, opens the door, and goes out trusting that Jesus is the anointed one, confident that the Spirit is in and among us. We know there are no easy answers and that suffering and sacrifice are part of the deal. My church is called to no small faith. My church is eager to transform the world with love and grace. May it be so. Amen.